Hi everyone, I just wanted to make a quick announcement before I start this video. I don't usually talk much about the behind-the-scenes type stuff, but I was in the process of moving while I was making this video. This last month has been incredibly busy, and given the circumstances, different parts were recorded in different locations. Since I'm getting used to this new location and trying to figure out the best layout for recording, there will be some noticeable differences in audio quality at different points. I apologize for this, and I will do my best to make sure this is a one-time issue. With that in mind, please enjoy this long overdue video. At this point in the Disney Villains retrospective, we've reached the 1980s, where a good deal of change was upon the studio. Although we've come pretty far, we still have a long way to go. But I believe that now is a good time to stop for a moment to take care of some materials that I either forgot or neglected, and also material that has come out since I started this project. A medieval bard in the modern world pointed out that this was indeed a good place for the bonus, since The Rescuers was the last movie that all the 9 old men worked on, making it the end of an era in a lot of ways. I still won't include every single little appearance the villain has had, since that would get redundant, but as always, I do hope to be thorough in general. I've had quite a few viewers reach out with ideas for things to include. Some of them were already on my radar, some were not. I did not screen cap every comment, but I just wanted to say to everyone that I do appreciate your input and engagement. Thank you all for continuing to watch and support these videos. First, we have the oldest Disney villain, Peg-Leg Pete. Both of his updates are regarding the Disney theme parks. I talked about Pete's silly sideshow in the first video, but I found a nifty new piece of information. According to this concept art, there was going to be a Pete animatronic at one point. I guess the plywood figure was what we got in his place. I have a personal attachment to that set piece, but man, I would have loved it if we gotten the animatronic instead. One mild frustration I found back when I worked at the sideshow was that Pete didn't actually appear. Guests would sometimes ask if they could meet Pete inside, and I would have to tell them, sorry, no. Well, hopefully that will change soon. Although Pete made incredibly rare appearances in ice shows and parades, he's never been a meetable character. Until now. Finally, guests can meet and greet with Pete in Disneyland's newly remodeled Toontown. It's about time. Here's hoping Pete can make it out to other parks at some point, including his long-neglected sideshow. Back when I did my second entry, the Phantom Blot had just been announced as a villain in the 3rd season of the DuckTales reboot. At that point, we didn't know much about his role, or that he would be voiced by Giancarlo Esposito. Well, now we know, and we can talk about him. Like many characters in that series, the Blot has been reimagined to the point where he barely resembles the original. Generally, I liked the new takes on these characters, but I kinda miss the classic Blot. The only thing this version shares with him is the costume and name. Now, I won't complain about his origin story, which is some solid supervillain material. Blot's village was callously destroyed by Magica De Spell. Swearing vengeance, Blot has been following the witch for years, getting stronger the whole time. While that's perfectly understandable, Blot's takeaway was that all magic is evil, dangerous, and must be destroyed. Although Magica gets most of his hatred, the McDuck family constantly dabbles in magic themselves, so they must also be stopped. His determination to go up against the McDucks earned him a position at Fowl. Blot is partnered up with Pepper, voiced by Amy Sedaris. Pepper is the yin to his yang, the salt to his pepper. Or the pepper to his salt, one of those. She's just as gung-ho about her job, but she's much more cheerful and willing to make small talk with her enemies. Blot initially despises working with her, but changes his attitude when he finds out that none of the other Fowl agents were willing to give him a chance. By the end, he actually appreciates having her around. It's actually pretty sweet, all things considered. We are almost at our feature film villains, but we have a few small updates on the Big Bad Wolf first. One appearance I neglected the first time was 1997's Redux Riding Hood. This short was meant to be part of an anthology film called Totally Twisted Fairy Tales. It's a wackier, more adult-skewed take on the classic story. The wolf, voiced by Michael Richards, has settled down since the fairy tale, married a sheep, and should be living happily ever after. But his absolute failure to eat Little Red still haunts him, leading to a very neurotic take on the character. The solution? Build a time machine to set things right. Of course, things don't go as he hopes. A second short was produced for the film, spoofing the Three Little Pigs. Only a single clip is publicly available for that one, featuring a different Big Bad Wolf voiced by Harvey Fierstein. The plot involves the pigs letting the wolf live with them, wanting to prove they're progressive-minded pigs of the 90s. But as they learn, a wolf is still a wolf. Although Redux Riding Hood garnered an Oscar nomination for Best Animated Short, it's largely been kept under wraps, and the full anthology was never completed. The classic Big Bad Wolf recently starred in an episode of The Wonderful World of Mickey Mouse. Sweet, naive Mickey tries to help the wolf become the big good wolf and befriend others instead of eating them. The wolf pretends to go along with Mickey's idea, not so discreetly eating everyone he can when Mickey's back is turned. In this appearance, the wolf is not voiced by Jim Cummings, but instead Clancy Brown. Brown gives him a deeper voice, hearkening more to his original appearances.
Isn't this the Three Little Pigs' house?
Oh, I bought him a new house in, Germany.
Mickey, get out of here before it's too late! Ouch!
I don't know. I just miss those times when we were young and innocent, and you could watch something and you wouldn't automatically think, gee, I wonder if this is the animator's fetish. Ah, youth. That makes a good segue into the evil queen from Snow White, who had her own starring episode of Mickey Mouse, this time voiced by Tress MacNeille. In Once Upon an Apple, the witch's attempts to poison Snow White are repeatedly thwarted by Mickey. It's all accidental, but that infuriates the witch even more. Things somehow get worse when the magic mirror, voiced by Chris Diamantopoulos, declares Mickey to be the fairest of them all.
Who's the fairest of the land and better than you and me? M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U.
Speaking of the mirror, he got a Spotlight TV special in 1987, the 50th anniversary of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In DTV Monster Hits, the mirror hosts a series of horror-themed music videos, all set to Disney clips. The mirror is played by Jeffrey Jones, and seems relieved that he doesn't have to deal with the evil queen's demands anymore. Even though he doesn't have to answer to his former employer, he still has a fondness for the dark and macabre, displaying a more devious sense of humor than he had in the movie.
When it comes to scheming, plotting, and revenge, heck hath no fury like a woman scorned, and I should know. I used to work for one of the unfairest of all.
The witch got to host her own Halloween feature in 2005. Once Upon a Halloween was a direct-to-video compilation movie focusing on Disney villains. It was sort of like that old Halloween treat special, but with the witch in place of that endearingly hokey pumpkin. It also had a plot. A slim and slightly confusing plot. The witch's powers are the strongest on Halloween, and she wants to take full control of the holiday. I'm assuming this is to make herself even stronger. Her cauldron, voiced by Corey Burton, contains the souls of all the great Disney villains. He shows her various clips as she considers which villain to summon to help her in her goals. By the end, the witch gets too ambitious in her plans and tries to summon every single villain in the cauldron. This backfires, and somehow she gets sucked in herself. The cauldron did try to warn her. He was created by the witches of Morva, just like the famous Black Cauldron. If you're wondering why you've never heard of this, it was only released in the UK. I didn't know about it until fairly recently. Snow White, the fairest of them all, was a live-action movie produced by Hallmark. It had a theatrical release in Europe, but its United States premiere was on The Wonderful World of Disney. As such, it's tangentially a Disney movie, worth a mention but not a full discussion. The Queen was played by Miranda Richardson, with her crone version played by Corinne Knovel. Over on the theme park end of things, I found some interesting storyboard ideas for the Disney on Parade show. As I've said before, this was a traveling show similar to Disney on Ice. A lot of this show was never properly documented, so I don't know if a lot of these ideas made it past the drawing board, but they're worth sharing. The drawings present a shortened version of Snow White's story. In this interpretation, the Queen transforms into the witch immediately after hearing the mayor's answer. She goes into the woods and uses her magic to bring the trees to life. Snow White is on a walk, and the witch orders the trees to kill the princess. The trees surround her, but the frightened girl is saved at the last minute by the seven dwarves, who are marching home. I find this interesting, since in the movie, the trees being alive is only part of Snow's imagination. Of course, it doesn't make the scene any less intense. I think we've also found the potential origins of the costume trees seen in certain shows and sing-alongs. Oh, and one drawing says there's also a song and dance number with the witch and trees doing a kickline. Once again, I don't know if this ever happened, but I really hope it did. The famously frightening Snow White attraction in Disneyland has been toned down over the years. Its current iteration, Snow White's Enchanted Wish, is probably the least frightening version, but the witch still gets to make a couple appearances in all her scary glory. Next, we have comics. Muppet Snow White, printed after Disney acquired the characters, has Miss Piggy as the evil queen. One of her many costumes is closely based on the Disney version. Fozzie plays her magic mirror, Sweetums is the huntsman, and Crazy Harry and Uncle Deadly are a pair of assassins hired after Sweetums fails at his job. Uncle Deadly in particular is used perfectly, combining the sinister early version of his character with the fussy wardrobe supervisor he became. He's the one who ties the lace too tightly around Snow White's waist. The Queen made an interesting appearance in the Kalala Princess manga. The series follows a young girl through the Disney princess stories in search of her missing friend. Early on, she and her love interest, Ray, find themselves in the world of Snow White. They wisely decide to ask the magic mirror where their friend is. Unfortunately, the Queen is still alive and sics her animals on them. She has a pair of ferocious wolves and the vultures from the movie. The vultures were really a hungry neutral party at first, but they're actively serving the Queen here. The Queen transforms herself into the witch and tries to steal the hero's magic tiara. Snow White gets a chance to confront her stepmother in this scene, which is brief but effective. In a lot of the old Disney comics with the witch, she'd often antagonize Snow, but they'd usually gloss over their original relationship. This time, Snow White's good heart comes through, recognizing the Queen for what she truly is. Very, very lonely. The old witch ends up falling into her own cauldron and turning into a vulture. There are a couple video games I neglected to mention the first time, although they're more on the lesser side. An unfinished prototype exists for an Atari game, where the dwarves need to find the prince before the witch can give Snow White the poison apple. As the players traverse the diamond mines and forest, the timer above is represented by the witch, slowly creeping toward the princess. A Game Boy Color game starring Snow White surprisingly did not feature much of the Queen. The first level does have Snow White exploring the castle and even the Queen's secret lab, but the only other character to appear is the huntsman, who just stands around in different locations. Later in the game, Dopey fights off the vultures, who appear to be working for the Queen, like in the manga. In the Game Boy Advance Disney Princess game, the witch turns the 7 dwarfs to stone, so Snow White has to restore them. One of her tasks is to traverse the haunted forest. Like in Disney on Parade, the trees have been enchanted by the witch to attack Snow White. There's a boss battle against the witch this time, with Snow White and Grumpy teaming up to take her down. I can't be alone in wishing that we'd gotten whatever game Mickey is playing in Runaway Brain, though. Although I talked about Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep in the first video, I neglected Kingdom Hearts Key. This mobile game follows the movie's plot closely, with cute chibi versions of all the characters. Unlike Birth by Sleep, the player actually gets a proper battle with the witch on the cliffs. She even summons her own Heartless, the Wretched Witch, who has exploding apples. The mobile game Disney Mirrorverse gave all its characters some pretty cool redesigns. The Queen is now able to fight on the battlefield. In addition to a new costume, the poison within her heart has begun to seep into her skin, making her wickedness visible even in her beautiful form. Another mobile game to feature the Queen is Disney Magic Kingdoms. The Queen tries a few new attempts to do away with Snow White. She considers using the classic comb or enchanted bodice, but decides against these when she finds out how long the spells will take to prepare. She tries a few other tricks, but gets thwarted by the dwarves and Snow White's animal friends. She's even more upset when her mirror tells her that there are now quite a few maidens who are fairer than her, all the other Disney princesses. My favorite little detail in the game is a special currency associated with the Queen. Grimhilda coins are named after the Queen's name from the movie's production. Well, we've talked about quite a few mobile games, but I know the one you're all really waiting for is Twisted Wonderland. Bishonen Disney characters ahoy! This game takes place long after the stories of the villains have played out. History has actually been kind to them. 7 of Disney's most infamous rogues are known as the Great Seven, and are the pride of Night Raven College. This magical boarding school bases its dormitories on these legendary figures, with the students all modeling themselves on their supposed virtues. Their evil deeds appear to have been forgotten, or at least downplayed over the years. The relevant house for this section is POMEFIORE, dedicated to the fairest queen. The students admire her devotion at maintaining her status as fairest of them all. House Warden Vil Schoenheit, voiced by Hiroki Aiba, is our main focus. By age 18, Vil has established a solid acting career, but has gotten typecasted in villainous roles. He's stunningly beautiful, but all his airs and graces make him unrelatable to the audience. His co-star, Neige LeBlanche, gets all the heroic leading roles. Imagine Snow White if she was a famous actress and influencer. Sorry, just had a little bile in my throat there. As the story goes on, much like his idol, Vil's drive to be #1 consumes him. He even goes so far as to try and poison Neige at one point, but his friends manage to help him get a grip on himself. His signature spell is fittingly called Fairest One of All, allowing him to curse anything he touches. The other major POMEFIORE students are Rook Hunt, voiced by Yujiro Itokawa, and Epple Felmier, voiced by Shimba Tsuchiya. Rook is loosely based on the Huntsman, if the character were much more flamboyant. He's very good at building his friends up and seeing the best in people. He's also a huge fan of Neige. Epple, meanwhile, comes from a country apple farming background, and even speaks with a thick southern accent in the American translation, but only when Vil isn't around. The house warden has made Epple into something of a personal project, wanting to mold him into the perfect gentleman. The magic mirror is referenced by two different objects. Vil has an app on his phone similar to Alexa or Siri called Mira. He often asks it to check who the fairest one of all is based on web data. Unfortunately for him, Neige is almost always number one. The college also has an artifact called the Dark Mirror, which strongly resembles the one from the movie. This object is responsible for determining who can enroll in college based on their magical potential. It also sorts them into the different dormitories, giving it some major Sorting Hat vibes. Finally, because nothing is sacred, we're getting a live-action remake of Snow White in the near future with Gal Gadot as the Queen. Speaking of unnecessary remakes, that's another great segue to the Pinocchio Villains. To say that fans were largely unhappy with the 2022 Pinocchio remake would be an understatement. I put off watching it until I decided to make this video myself. Although it was not quite the absolute cinematic travesty many people said it was, it really wasn't very good and often made irritating or baffling choices. We all know about Pinocchio staring in awe at horse manure. Even in relatively decent moments, I kept thinking to myself, but the original one did this so much better. I know it seems like I'm going off on a tangent right off the bat, but that last statement ties into our first two villains, Foulfellow and Gideon. Foulfellow worked so well in traditional animation. He was essentially a human being with a fox's head. He's the same thing here, but the effect is much creepier, especially with the more realistic face. Maybe that was the point, but it lacked the appeal of the original design. Keegan-Michael Key gives a spirited performance, definitely drawing from the original. He's still a showman at heart, with every statement accompanied by several dramatic flourishes. While I love his energy, I wish the material he had to work with was funnier. Him saying Pinocchio could be an influencer makes me wince internally.
We need a simple, strong stage name. I've got it. Chris Pine!
Gideon, meanwhile, remains silent, and mostly exists to be smacked around by his companion. This was largely his role in the classic movie as well, but he had a few more opportunities to show off his own airheaded personality. The fox and cat actually play a much smaller role in the remake. They make their leave after taking Pinocchio to Stromboli. Frustratingly, the remake also proves them right to an extent. The whole idea of the Pinocchio story is about a naughty puppet learning to make the right choices and earn his humanity. The morality is very cut and dry. Pinocchio doesn't go to school like he's supposed to, and bad things happen. Later in the book, he does go to school, and good things happen, until he chooses to skip school for Pleasure Island, which leads to more bad things. Here, he actually does initially leave Foulfellow to go to school, but he gets turned away by the headmaster because he's a puppet. I know the remake has an angle about what it truly means to be a real boy, but muddying the water with this confused morality really throws everything off course. Foulfellow is temptation, but now the story's saying that Pinocchio is right to listen to him because school, in his case, is not an option. Okay, before this rant gets any longer, let's move to Stromboli. The Wicked Puppet Master, played by Giuseppe Battison, again worked better in animation. That medium allowed Stromboli to be as big as humanly possible, skirting the line between funny and frightening. When the exact same grand gestures are used in live action, coupled with his wild appearance, it ends up being a little too over the top. A good balance seems to be hard to accomplish, since I believe the live-action Jafar was too understated. Maybe I'm just unpleasable. We get to see a little more of Stromboli's crew in this version. I admit I always kind of wondered who Stromboli actually had working for him, since we never saw anyone else directly in the first movie. As it turns out, Stromboli is just as bad to his other performers, even scolding one when she performs a private song for Pinocchio. I know he's a selfish monster, but I think that he'd be okay with his puppeteers rehearsing between shows. Stromboli's mistreatment of his crew ends up being his downfall. He actually gets arrested for stealing their funds, making him the only villain in the movie to receive punishment. The 1940 Pinocchio is famously a Disney movie where all the villains get away with their heinous misdeeds. As unpleasant as that may be, I kinda like it. It makes the dark movie even darker, and it's a pretty apt statement on real life. Sometimes, oftentimes even, bad people go unpunished. In that way, the movie with the magic living puppet and a talking cricket ended up being one of the realest Disney films. I think that having Stromboli face punishment, even if it's satisfying to a degree, takes away some of the story's bite. Taking away the story's bite transitions us nicely to the final villain, the Coachman, played by Luke Evans. Quite a few things have been altered about Pleasure Island, some that work better than others. I'll talk about the good parts first. Pinocchio is quite literally swept up onto the coach when heading home, rather than allowing himself to be tricked by Foul again. I heard some people complaining about this, saying that it strips Pinocchio of his agency. I kind of disagree on that. The way Foul talks circles around him in the original had a similar effect. The moment of truth comes farther down the road, literally, when Pinocchio is essentially given a choice as to whether or not he wants to get off the coach and go home. There's a message about the evils of peer pressure that does feel kind of shoehorned in, but I like that Pinocchio is presented with a clear moral choice, and he chooses wrong. It's very in line with the original book. The animated one never really had a moment like that. Pleasure Island looks pretty good. While I'll still always choose the first movie over this one, I can tell the set designers and animators had a good time putting this one together. The original movie had maybe one large clown head, but I like that this one doubled down on that, having an entire squadron of clown mascots plastered throughout the island. I'm more in the middle about Evans as the Coachman. I can tell he's having fun being skeevy and creepy, but I prefer the more benign-looking classic Coachman. It makes the moments where he drops his mask all the scarier. Right from the start, this Coachman seems even less trustworthy than the other villains. One detail I like is how he seems to follow Pinocchio and Lampwick throughout their stay. Yes, part of it is because Pinocchio is the main character, but it also makes sense. Pinocchio is a living puppet, so of course that would pique the Coachman's interest. Similarly, there's nothing wrong with his smoke monster henchmen. I actually like the visual of the Coachman riding on two of them with their glowing eyes acting like headlights. But I still prefer the weird gorilla-like creatures from the first movie. I found them creepier and more mysterious, since you never got a good look at them in the light. As for the bad, I feel that Pleasure Island just doesn't pack the same punch. I get that they might not have wanted to show actual child actors smoking or drinking, even with CG effects, but it ruins the point. Pleasure Island is all about temptations, and although some of the attractions are tempting indeed, the point is they're bad. Animated Pinocchio's reaction to a cigar probably put more than a few kids off the idea of tobacco. Here, they loudly clarify that everyone's drinking root beer nearly a dozen times, to the point that it's unintentionally funny. Pinocchio himself never really joins in the worst misdeeds. In the original, you can see him happily going along with whatever Lampwick says. Now, it feels like there's not a lesson to be learned, since Pinocchio already knows right from wrong at this point. The destructive, negative nature of Pleasure Island isn't as strong. Kids holding up hateful signs and screaming at each other doesn't have the same punch as seeing them get into actual brawls. Again, literally. And again, I know that would be hard with child actors, but I digress. Oh, and Monstro's a sea monster instead of a whale. I still don't really think of him as a true villain, just a really pissed off predator. If there's one thing I've learned from this remake trend, it's this. No matter how talented or hardworking the crew is for the remake, you can't beat the original. Especially if it's a movie as beautiful and well-crafted as Pinocchio.
Chaos reigns.
A musical version of Pinocchio was staged in 2017 by the Royal National Theatre in London. It is not treated as an official Disney theatrical production, but was done in cooperation with the company. There are not too many details I can find online outside of some pictures, a little bit of footage, and a summary on Wikipedia. This version plays up Foul's role. As far as I can tell, he is only referred to as the Fox. At the beginning, the Fox tries to cut down the enchanted tree that is used to carve Pinocchio. When he fails, the Fox stalks the puppet as vengeance, going out of his way to make Pinocchio's life difficult. Contrast this with the movie, where he runs into Pinocchio a few times by chance, and just tries to make some easy money off a gullible child. He's defeated when Jiminy cuts off his tail, which is apparently the source of his power. Maybe it makes more sense in the show itself. Foul and Stromboli are featured in the Magic Kingdom's mobile game. According to the Fox, Gideon is out of town. We find out that Stromboli has developed a grudge against Foul ever since Pinocchio escaped him. One of the game's storylines takes place parallel to a Hunchback storyline featuring Judge Frollo. Jiminy and Geppetto are excited that a judge is coming to town. They hope it will lessen the amount of kidnappings that have happened recently. Given that Pinocchio was kidnapped twice within the same night, I don't blame them. The Blue Fairy leaves them a letter about Frollo, hoping it will guide their hearts in the right path. Just because someone says they stand for justice, doesn't mean they always follow through. Foul gets his hands on the note and considers using it for blackmail. After all, most public figures haven't tried to drown a deformed baby. At least, I hope they haven't. Stromboli is horrified by the story. Arresting innocent people and burning a city to the ground is all right, but persecution against puppeteers is what really worries him. Oh, and in case you were wondering, Pinocchio never actually meets Frollo himself. The kid's been through enough already.
Root beer! Look! Free root beer!
There you go, gents.
In regards to Bambi, this is not really an update, just a clarification. In my video on the dreaded man, I pointed out that the mysterious hunter is mostly a villain in the eyes of the forest animals. His true nature and intentions were up for interpretation. Quite a few commenters have pointed out that shooting a doe with a child is illegal in many areas, which means that man, at least the one that infamously killed Bambi's mom, could at least be considered a true villain, or at least a lawbreaker. The Three Caballeros is a weird case. As I've said in the past, the movie itself doesn't really have a plot, so it doesn't have a villain. Much later, in 2018, The Legend of the Three Caballeros premiered. Although it has the titular trio as the heroes, along with the Araquan bird, it really doesn't have that much to do with the movie. For that reason, I didn't talk about it when I was covering the package films. At the same time, it's linked closely enough with them that I kind of regret not talking about it earlier. It just didn't seem like the right moment. I thought about including it in my eventual Carl Barks entry, but there are enough villains in that already. I think this video is the best place to talk about the Shelled Goose family. In this series, Donald, Jose, and Panchito are the descendants of the original Caballeros, knights who once defeated the evil sorcerer Lord Feldrake, trapping him in his own staff. Years later, Feldrake has returned with the aid of his own descendant, Baron von Sheldgoose. Once again, the magical forces of good and evil will clash. Feldrake, voiced by Kevin Michael Richardson, is still trapped in his staff for most of the series. Although he can use some magic in that form, he's not up to his full evil potential. That's where Sheldgoose comes in. Voiced by Wayne Knight, Sheldgoose is the president of the New Quackmore Institute of Art, Culture, and Science. He lives in a glorious mansion, has a squadron of Rottweiler servants, who he apparently raised, and loves flaunting his wealth and status. As we see throughout the series, he's quite ruthless. Although he is as evil as Feldrake, he's not really equipped for being a sorcerer's apprentice. Feldrake can only do so much as a staff, and needs Sheldgoose to help him rebuild his evil army and free him from his prison.
So many traps. How do you know where they all are?
I discovered this place long, long ago.
Is this your tomb?
No, you nincompoop! I'm not dead! I'm a staff!
Similarly, the Caballeros themselves are not prepared to deal with saving the world from evil forces. They have their own magical ally, Xandra, the goddess of adventure, to guide them. Xandra encourages the Caballeros to find their inner heroes and be their best possible selves. Feldrake is not as nice a teacher, spending most of his time berating Sheldgoose. The very rare moments where he finds something kind to say are followed by him taking it back a second later. Cruel as he is, Feldrake has a point. Sheldgoose is generally unhelpful, although he does try. Still, even in his moments where he does harness his wicked magic, he's ultimately more concerned with petty grievances than the big evil picture. The only character Feldrake truly loves is Leopold the Horrible. His old pet from ages ago, Leopold is a chimera made of different animal parts, forming a horrific monkey-bat-donkey rat. He has a face only a mother could love, and Feldrake certainly loves his precious monster. Despite his appearance and loyalty to Feldrake, Leopold is pretty benign when he isn't actively serving his owner. He doesn't talk that much, but when he does, he's voiced by D. Bradley Baker, who also gets to do many grunts and creature noises.
I still love you, Daddy.
You're crushing me, Leopold.
Later, we get to meet Sheldgoose's many other ancestors, all of them also voiced by Wayne Knight. The whole Sheldgoose line is made up of one rotten egg after the next. Any major disaster in history has had a Sheldgoose involved. They're revealed to be closely linked with Donald Duck's own family, beyond the original Caballero defeating Feldrake. Donald's great-grandfather, Clinton Coote, founded the New Quackmore Institute, but had it stolen by Baroness von Sheldgoose. There are other villains in the series, mostly one-shots, but I generally like to keep my focus on the main or recurring bad guys. Due to the Disney Channel mishandling how the show was aired, I think a lot of people slept on the series or didn't even know about it. It was also somewhat overshadowed by the DuckTales reboot. I like both of them, and I hope this video can encourage people to seek out The Legend on Disney+. With Feldrake and Sheldgoose given their due, let's move on to the next package film. The Making of Walt Disney's Fun and Fancy Free by J.B. Kaufman reveals some interesting details about the bongo segment. When Bongo was considered as a feature film, it had more characters to flesh out the plot. A chimpanzee named Chimpy was Bongo's close friend in the earliest drafts, but was soon developed into a more antagonistic figure. He became Bongo's trainer, who leeched off the circus bear's natural talent. Bongo really did most of the work, Chimpy just found fame and glory by association. Chimpy was to follow Bongo into the wilderness after he escapes. In one version, they run into a buzzard named Satchel, described as a swingin' Phil Harris type. Satchel offers to help Chimpy in getting Bongo back to the circus. The ape doesn't realize it, but the buzzard really wants to make a meal out of the other circus animals. Somehow, he later reforms and becomes their band leader. In another version of the script, Chimpy tries to ensure Bongo returns to the circus by having Lumpjaw thrash the poor little bear. Bongo goes into a deep depression, not wanting to do anything after that, circus or otherwise. Chimpy, now in full sleaze mode, offers Lumpjaw a job at the circus instead. Voices considered for Lumpjaw included Wallace Beery or Billy Gilbert. Although the character never ended up actually speaking, Gilbert still got a role in the film as Willie the Giant. We have one more package film to go. This one's a quickie. The Headless Horseman made an appearance in the Descendants short Wicked Woods. After Uma and Audrey dress as the Spectre to scare their friends, the teens run into the real deal. Luckily, they get on his good side and give him some candy. Butterscotch is his favorite. Mr. Headless is voiced by Armin Taylor in this appearance. Interestingly, a flashback reveals the closest thing we've seen to what he looked like when he still had a head.
Happy Halloween!
There are several live-action versions of Cinderella I've yet to mention. Two of them were filmed versions of pre-existing, non-Disney musicals. For completion's sake, I'll give them a quick mention here. The 1997 Rodgers and Hammerstein Cinderella premiered on The Wonderful World of Disney. Bernadette Peters played the stepmother, with her daughters Calliope and Minerva, played by Vianne Cox and Natalie Desselle. Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods came to the screen in 2014. Cinderella's stepfamily, although not major characters, are still part of the story. We have Christine Baranski as the stepmother, Tammy Blanchard as Florinda, and Lucy Punch as Lucinda. I guess it's also worth mentioning Johnny Depp as the Big Bad Wolf. Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister premiered in 2002 on The Wonderful World of Disney. Based on the novel of the same name, it focuses on one of the stepsisters, Iris Fisher, played by Azura Skye. The other stepsister, Ruth, is played by Emma Poole, and the stepmother, Margaret, is played by Stockard Channing. The book was by Gregory Maguire, who also wrote Wicked and is in the same vein. In other words, Iris is not actually the villain. The final live-action movie we'll briefly touch on is the recent Sneakerella. A gender-swapped, modernized version, it follows the Cinderella stand-in, who aspires to be a great shoe designer. His stepfather, Trey, played by Brian Terrell Clark, is not as awful as the typical stepmother. He's just overworked, distracted, and distant. His stepsons, meanwhile, are the usual brats you'd expect. Zelly and Stacy, played by Colton Stewart and Hayward Leach, remain antagonistic toward their stepbrother. Back on the classic end of things, the Tremaines appeared in the Kalala Princess manga. In their chapter, they steal Kalala's magic tiara and try to use it to hypnotize the prince into marrying one of them. While we've seen Anastasia almost end up with Prince Charming in one of the sequels and the Twice Charmed musical, this time it's Drizella who comes the closest to snagging a royal husband. The Magic Kingdoms game appears to take place directly after the movie. Either it's ignored the sequels, or they haven't happened yet. Disney canon, as always, is pretty loose. This means that Anastasia and Drizella are as unpleasant and buffoonish as ever. Luckily, they no longer have any real power over Cinderella, even if they do guilt her into inviting them to one of her balls. On a more positive note, we get to see Cinderella finally stand up to Lady Tremaine when she tries to intimidate her stepdaughter. She doesn't give Tremaine the real telling off she deserves, because that's not the kind of person Cindy is. But it's nice to see her directly tell Tremaine that she can't push her around anymore. The sequels never really gave her that chance. In Twisted Wonderland, Moses Train is a history teacher inspired by Lady Tremaine. Voiced by Rakia Kayama, this stern, no-nonsense professor even has a Lucifer-inspired cat, Lucius. At this point, at least in the English translation, we haven't gotten much material for the character, so we might have to check back at a future date. From Twisted Wonderland to the original, it's time to head back down the famous rabbit hole. Alice's Wonderland Bakery takes place in the present day, with Alice's great-granddaughter, also named Alice. As the title implies, Alice runs a bakery in Wonderland, and is close friends with the descendants of the other characters. It bears a passing resemblance to Adventures in Wonderland, since it takes inspiration from the movie and book, but with generally kinder versions of the cast. For this reason, I won't dwell too much on the show, aside from a quick rundown. The Queen of Hearts, voiced by Eden Espinosa, is nowhere near as tyrannical as the original. Instead of possessing an uncontrollable temper, she has a major flair for the dramatic. Whenever a contest is held in Wonderland, the Queen is usually one of the judges. Now her subjects loyally serve her, not out of fear, but of genuine love and respect for their eccentric ruler. Her daughter, Rosa, voiced by Abigail Estrella, is one of Alice's closest friends. The Queen does not have a husband, but there is a King of Hearts. Voiced by John Cicada, he's the Queen's father in this version and has a passion for dancing. Unlike most of the other characters, the Cheshire Cat, voiced by Max Mittelman, is not a descendant. He's the real deal, the original package. Like everyone else, he's much nicer than he was in the movie. While he still has a mischievous side and likes to pull little pranks, I can't picture him actively trying to get Alice in trouble. Maybe he's mellowed out with age. Going back to the classic version, the Queen of Hearts is another of the many characters in the Magic Kingdom's mobile game. Poor Alice continuously finds herself on the Queen's bad side. Sometimes this is prompted by the Cheshire Cat, who really just wants to watch the enchanted world burn. Fortunately, the Queen is easily distracted, like all Wonderland denizens, and Alice always manages to keep her head in the end. In one storyline, the Queen becomes enamored with Constance Hatchaway, the ghostly murderous bride from the Haunted Mansion. She also has a fondness for decapitations. The Queen initially wants to befriend the ghost, but changes her mind when she hears that Constance killed her 5 husbands. After all, the King of Hearts is the only one who's off-limits in the Queen's book. Once again, the Queen's unconditional love for the King is surprisingly touching. Over in Twisted Wonderland, we have the students living in the Heartslebule dorm. Apologies if I mispronounced that. These boys admire the Queen of Hearts for her ability to bring order to the otherwise chaotic Wonderland. They emphasize not necessarily her tyranny, but rather her large list of rules, 810 of them to be exact. No one is a more staunch follower than House Warden Riddle Rosehearts, voiced by Nasuki Hane. Riddle was raised by incredibly strict parents, especially his mother. Wanting their son to be perfect, they controlled their son's life to the letter. Although Rose found great success in academics as a result, he was left emotionally scarred. Heartslebule House Wardens have always been sticklers for the Queen's rules, but Riddle surpasses all of them. He has every rule memorized, follows them all, and forces everyone else to do the same. Even the smallest of infractions, like not preparing tea properly, will result in punishment. That punishment is his signature spell. The Off With Your Head spell does not decapitate victims, but instead puts a heart-shaped collar on them, preventing them from using magic. Only Riddle can remove the collars, so he's feared by all the other students. In the early chapters of Twisted Wonderland, Riddle is forced to finally face his past and realize that no one is perfect, not even him. He is able to admit that even he doesn't like following every single rule all the time, and loosens up, making his dorm a happier place for all. Other major students in the dorm are inspired by the Queen's playing card soldiers. These include Ace Trappola, Deuce Spade, Cater Diamond, and Trey Clover. There's also a Cheshire Cat-based character, Chenya, voiced by Kento Hama. He does not attend Night Raven College. Instead, he goes to their rival, Royal Sword Academy. Despite this, he remains close with Riddle and Trey, knowing them since childhood. Like the famous cat, he can appear and disappear at will, and likes to mess around with people. The Walrus and the Carpenter do not get equivalent characters. Sorry to everyone who is craving a gorgeous anime boy walrus, but their story is referenced. One of the cooking ingredients mentioned is walrus brand oyster sauce. It's time to talk about another remake, that being Peter Pan and Wendy. I usually don't give spoiler warnings in these retrospectives, but given how recently this movie came out, I'm going to issue a quick one here. Jude Law is our Captain Hook this time, and I'll start with a positive statement. He did a really good job in the role. Unfortunately, while his performance was great, the rest of the movie did not live up to those standards. Hook is a broken man from the start. He's prone to violent outbursts, and often has a 1,000-yard stare. While the character is always exasperated at Peter's presence, this Hook is especially hateful of the boy, even outlawing his name from being spoken aloud. Hook, adult that he is, has at least 44 strict rules that all pirates must follow, that being one of them. One minor departure from Peter Pan tradition is not having Hook and the father being played by the same actor. The symbolism, obvious as it may be, always worked well in the story's favor and gave whichever actor was in the role a great opportunity. The father in this version is Alan Tudyk, who gets surprisingly underused. That was the small difference. The big difference, the crocodile in the room as it were, is Hook's backstory. We all know that Peter Pan cut off the captain's hand and fed it to the crocodile, thus igniting their eternal feud. But did you ever wonder why they were fighting? No? Me neither. Peter's the hero, Hook's the pirate. It's Neverland. Of course they'll fight. This movie gives the characters a tragic backstory about how Hook was once a lost boy, how they used to be friends, and how Peter ultimately pushed Hook into becoming the wretched pirate he is today. Like I said, to Law's credit, he plays the pathos for all they're worth, but it takes away the fun of the character. It feels like an oddly moot point to compare him to the Hans Conried classic. This remake feels incredibly divorced from the animated version, minus an orchestral version of You Can Fly that plays during the journey to Neverland, and a few very small plot details, like Tinkerbell getting trapped in a lantern. What I'm trying to say is, this might be the least fun Hook I've ever seen. Even in darker versions of the character, like Jason Isaacs' portrayal, there's an element of whimsy, since we're in Neverland and he's a pirate captain. Because of the tragedy heaped onto Hook, he's a sad, bitter character. His hatred of Peter feels more justified than ever, if that was even possible. Before, we could still understand why he had it in for the boy. Because of Peter, Hook can never have a moment's rest, thanks to the crocodile stalking him. But we barely see the croc at all in this version, making it feel more like an afterthought. This is hatred born of betrayal, and it blurs the lines between hero and villain a bit too much. Even in the end, the Hook-Pan dynamic feels totally unresolved, as if they're baiting us for a sequel or something. A sequel Hook, if you will. See what I did there? The biggest problem is, Hook's new backstory feels entirely unnecessary. It's an attempt to add a new dimension to a story that's over 100 years old, which I understand, but it doesn't really pay off. In fact, it sort of misunderstands one of the original story's points, and Wendy's role in the narrative. Neverland is a bedtime story come to life, full of distinct characters with admittedly shallow motivations. Pirates, natives, lost boys, feral beasts, it's all a giant game. Peter and Hook are eternally fighting because that's how the story goes. Neverland runs on this fairy tale logic, and it sounds like a great place to be for a kid. Once Wendy actually visits the land she's always dreamed of, she realizes how frustrating and unhappy a world that never changes is. She's a real person, while Peter and Hook are not. By the very nature of Neverland, I really don't think Hook needs an extensive origin. Now, to be fair, James Barrie actually gave Hook a backstory himself, about his school days before he became a rogue pirate. The thing is, this backstory was told during a speech given at Eton College after the story had become a success. It was simply a fun bonus for the students attending the lecture, and the Peter Pan story can be enjoyed without knowing any of this. Whew, now for the rest of the crew. Smee, of course, is always by Hook's side. Jim Gaffigan plays him as a hushed, timid yes-man. It was Smee who rescued young James as a boy, watching him rise to the ranks of captain. Although he seems more than a bit perturbed about how Hook turned out, his loyalty doesn't waver. While he gets a few amusing lines in, they really play down the comedic aspects normally seen with his character. There's one exchange that Smee and Hook have after Wendy walks the plank that's admittedly pretty funny. It feels like something that could have been in the original story, but it also seems out of place in the increasingly somber atmosphere they've been building up. Like in the animated film, the Jolly Roger is crawling with pirates, played by dozens upon dozens of actors. In fact, there are several women aboard in the ensemble.
So?
Two notable pirates stand out. First mate Bill Jukes is played by John DeSantis with a deep, booming baritone. Gurley, played by Garfield Wilson, adds some comic relief with his odd obsession with Michael's teddy bear. Like I said, the famous crocodile is barely there, although when he does appear, he's larger than life. The many spears protruding from his back are a nice touch. He's taken a licking, but keeps on ticking. I am more proud of writing that than I should be. This should be the last remake I'm going to talk about for a while, until we get to the Ursula video. I'm kind of relieved, since the remakes have frequently brought out my negative side. The thing is, I'm a fan of these original movies. I wouldn't be making these videos if I wasn't. But it often feels like the people making these remakes either don't understand the source material, or at times actively dislike it. The attempts to modernize or change the story rarely capture the magic of the originals. So for one last time in this video, I will hold out hope that we can get back to new stories and let these classics stand on their own. If it's any consolation though, I think more people appreciate the original Peter Pan and Pinocchio than ever now. Also, I'm aware that Peter Pan characters are involved in the new Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers movie. Rather than talk about that here, I'll wait for the actual Rescue Rangers video. The Mirrorverse game presents a slightly darker, more competent Hook. He has actually conquered his fears, and now wears a crocodile pelt. The pelt is not the beloved TikTok croc, it's much too small, but wearing it is certainly a power move. The artists were aware that Hook can be a real threat when he's not being beaten by Peter Pan, and designed him accordingly. From one great Mirrorverse villain to another, let's take a look at Maleficent. This version is in a half-fairy, half-dragon state. Still all evil, of course. Meanwhile, some of the game's monsters, the Fractured, resemble Maleficent's goons. Others look like Prince John's rhino guards. Over in Twisted Wonderland, Maleficent is one of the Great Seven, known as the Thorn Fairy. She is remembered for her impressive magic skills. Her ability to control storms, ensnare an entire kingdom in thorns, and turn into a dragon are highlighted, although no one talks about the context of these actions. Her dedicated dorm is called Diasomnia, with House Warden Malice Draconia. As of right now, his chapter in the game is not translated into English. For that reason, I'll be skipping him, but I'm sure he'll be talked about in another catch-up entry later on. We'll stay in Twisted Wonderland for our Haunted Mansion update. As I said in the original video, the ghosts in the mansion are generally depicted as lovable pranksters, not malicious spirits. One of the major exceptions is the ghostly bride. Constance Hatchaway, the bride currently seen in the American mansions, is an outright Black Widow, beheading her 5 husbands and showing no remorse. Even in the earlier versions of the ride, and current Japanese iteration, the attic is a notably more somber, scarier room than the rest of the mansion. It's not that much of a surprise that out of all the ghosts, Twisted Wonderland chose her to appear in the game for a special event. What is a surprise is that she's not a cute anime boy version. From what I've seen, you can count the women that appear in this game on one hand, the Phantom Bride included. She is given the name Eliza in this version. I wonder if that's perhaps a reference to the 2003 movie, where the bride was named Elizabeth. Eliza was a princess 500 years ago, who was killed before her wedding day. Now, she and her ghostly servants return each year to find a new prince for her to marry and hold on to for the rest of her afterlife. Her list of specifications for the perfect man have been impossible to meet thus far, so no one takes her as much of a threat. This year, though, she decides that Idia Shroud, based on Hades, is her ideal husband. Idia, an antisocial shut-in, is clearly not the marrying type, and is even more against the idea when it turns out that he'll die upon being kissed by Eliza. Eliza is so enraptured at finding her prince charming that she outright ignores poor Idia's protests, only hearing what she wants to hear. When he tries to run, she paralyzes him with a single touch, still not taking the hint that he's not interested. When Idia's classmates try to save him, most of them wind up paralyzed as well. Her ghostly servants are just as stubborn as she is. In addition to being one of the token ladies, Eliza feels like the first true villain in the game that we're discussing. While the other characters we've seen have had their moments of going too far, they're always brought back down to earth by their friends. Their good sides always come through. When they come to their senses, they are horrified at what they almost became and give a genuine apology to everyone affected. Although Eliza does part on semi-good terms with everyone, she still never seems to realize that she terrorized an entire school and almost killed an innocent teenager. Everyone is just relieved to be rid of her in the end. There's also a web game that's worth mentioning. The Black Widow Bride featured Constance as the villain. She's going out of her way to victimize all 999 ghosts in the mansion, who are her potential victims. I mean, they're already dead, but perhaps Constance has a fate worse than death in mind. Players control the 3 heroic hitchhiking ghosts to explore the house and free the spirits before Constance catches them. They also need to free her 5 murdered husbands. I've heard of bridezillas, but this is ridiculous. There's also a last-minute addition to this video that I was just alerted about. While I'm not getting into the Jungle Cruise movie, one version of the attraction had a villain I was unaware of. In 2015, Hong Kong Disneyland had a month-long Halloween overlay of the attraction called Jungle River Cruise: Curse of the Emerald Trinity. If you've seen my entry on Disney theme park villains, you'll recall that Tokyo's Tower of Terror was based around an unscrupulous treasure hunter and a cursed artifact he stole. This ride is in the same vein. Garrett Reed, disgraced former member of the Society of Explorers and Adventurers, has set off in search of 3 jewels, the titular Emerald Trinity. When he doesn't return from the jungle, guests are sent in to search for him. They do catch a glimpse of Mr. Reed in his final moments. The jungle spirits have not taken kindly to his theft of the emeralds, and he is killed by vines overtaking his campsite. Now the jungle turns his attention to the guests. Their own skipper, The fun-loving master of corny jokes has secretly pocketed one of the emeralds for himself, making everyone on board a target. What a twist. Say, is that Bert the Bunyip? No, it's just a vengeful spirit rising from the water. This being a Disney park, guests did escape with the skipper's emerald mysteriously disappearing from his possession. I'm really thankful there's any footage of this out there, as it was only around for a single month, and plenty of other Hong Kong Halloween haunts remain a mystery. Cruella De Vil's Twisted Wonderland counterpart was discussed in her original video, so I don't need to talk about him again. We do, however, have a few other mobile games to touch on. Cruella appears in the Mirrorverse, sporting a new hairdo, a snazzy coat, and a sonic disruptor. Now that she's armed, the Dalmatians have even more of a reason to steer clear of her. Over in the Magic Kingdoms game, Cruella manages to kidnap some of the puppies again. This time, her plan is to ransom them until Roger stops his Cruella De Vil song from airing on the radio. Then she plans to steal them again to make that coat. She never seems to learn from all these failures, but to some extent, I admire her determination. I have a fun update in regards to Madame Mim. In my video on her, I mentioned that while she did appear in an ice show, we've never seen her at the Disney parks. Wouldn't you know it, but a few months after that video came out, she appeared at Disneyland. Guests at Oogie Boogie's Bash could meet the marvelous Mad Madame Mim. Very nice. Or rather, very bad. She'd prefer that. I'd rather stay on her good side. Or bad side. This is confusing. I'm moving on to the last character. Shere Khan is yet another character to appear in the Magic Kingdoms game. In his storyline, Mowgli, Baloo, and Bagheera all team up to defeat the tiger. Kaa is merely mentioned, and old King Louie doesn't do that much of consequence. I said in my Jungle Book video that Shere Khan has never been a walk-around character. While that may be true in the theme parks, he did appear in Disney on Ice. The costume is... well, it's really something.
This better not awaken anything in me.
On that unsettling note, I believe we're mostly caught up. I can't say I'll ever cover everything 100%, but hey, I'm only human. As always, I want to thank everyone for their continued support, viewership, and patience. These videos are pretty much a one-man operation, so they can take time. Thank you all for understanding. In our next video, we'll be back on track with The Fox and the Hound. Amos Slade is one of the first Disney villains to have a real nuance to his motivations, to the point where some might not consider him a true bad guy. I've thought a lot about this, and it's certainly complicated, but we'll get to that soon enough. Also, as a bonus, we'll head far from the nature preserve and into cyberspace. There, we'll take a quick look at Disney's first computer-generated villain, the MCP. It's the 80s, alright.